I've met enough spooks in my life, on the road, in my great international odyssey with the Progressive International and elsewhere, to know that like these places are crawling with CIA people, with spies, with people whose jobs it is to run interference and pay off certain people. And I've seen enough duffel bags of cash in my career to understand that things happen all the time to try to buy votes and buy influence and carve new paths towards different political outcomes that may or may not reflect the democratic will of the people.
It's already being called the scandal of the century. In Honduras, a small but vitally important Central American country, we may have just gotten a glimpse of how a global far-right power network operates. It's a story that allegedly takes in the presidency of Donald Trump, the Prime Minister of Israel, the former president of Honduras, who was once imprisoned by the Americans for 45 years and then inexplicably pardoned by Trump, a bunch of his cronies, and of course the US deep state. And the story also includes a host of other peripheral characters, familiar, but now recast in a strange light. Peter Thiel, the drug kingpin El Chapo, the presidents of Brazil, Bolivia, Mexico, and Colombia. The scandal is called Hondurasgate, and the mainstream media so far haven't touched it. For all its contingency and allure, it fits snugly into the story of imperialism in Latin America. But is it actually true? And how do we know if the claims presented on the website hondurasgate.ch relate to something real in the world? Should we simply expect to live forevermore in a world of deep uncertainty, presented with an endless succession of claims that we can neither disprove nor verify? And in what sense does it even matter if it is true? To discuss this rapidly developing story, the history of the claims made, and to perhaps answer some of those slightly more puzzling questions, I'm joined by David Adler, the co-general coordinator of the Progressive International and an expert in Latin American politics. David Adler, welcome to Do Your Own Research.
Thanks so much for having me on to talk about such a bombshell revelation like Honduras Gate.
Tell us, what is that bombshell?
Honduras Gate reveals an operation that not only spans the Americas, but in its Israeli dimension, as we'll touch on, Richard, also kind of touches on the architecture of what we've been calling the reactionary international. That is a more global network of politicians, of course, and political actors who are the kind of vanguard of the reactionary international, but also consultants, financiers, entrepreneurs, technologists, this big network that's propelling a kind of reactionary agenda of extraction, of exploitation, undermining democratic norms, freedoms, and institutions across the world. So Honduras Gate narrowly is a set of leaked audio files, 37 in total, across different platforms that have been now verified by a couple of different outlets using a couple of different types of software that reveal in pretty stunning detail, because they come in the mouths of the operators of this reactionary international themselves, reveal in pretty stunning detail the financial operations, the mediatic operations, the political machinations that have at their very geographical epicenter of Honduras led to an electoral coup that has installed this puppet government of Tito Asfura. I'm sure we'll get into that. But more generally shed light on an operation that stretches from Tel Aviv to Washington to Buenos Aires to destabilize democracies across the Americas, and in particular to target progressive leaders and presidents such as Mexico's Claudia Sheinbaum and Colombia's Gustavo Petro. So it's a complex web, but with some pretty familiar faces of people who are operating across borders, conducting what are objectively criminal activities in service of this destabilization agenda to try to put their people into power, to try to realign the pieces of the hemisphere towards a more US and Israeli friendly geopolitical and geoeconomic agenda.
Sorry for the interruption. You may have noticed recently that Novara Media is trying to get 3,000 more supporters to back us. And that's because we've got massive plans. Maybe when they're fulfilled, they might even let me out of this room. If you believe in what we're doing, if you want to see us cover more of the stories like we're covering in this episode that the mainstream media just will not touch, go to novaramedia.com/support and pledge as little as £1 per month. Thanks for watching. So you're saying there that it is a objectively criminal enterprise, and if the allegations are proved, that would of course be the case. But I'm going to stick with the alleged for reasons that I think we'll get into in a bit later. Not just because of legal reasons, because I'm sort of like legally a coward or something, although I am legally a coward, but also because like there is a kind of uncertainty that I think that this investigation, Hondurasgate.ch, people can go and look at the website for themselves, reveals about the modern world. You said that the audio recordings have been verified, but they are the subject of a sort of contestation, right? They are the subject of people, at least the subjects of the audio recordings. So our main character, Juan Orlando Hernandez, right? He has disputed that these are the allegations, that this is his voice, right? He said that it's probably fake or some sort of AI or something like this. And we are living in that era of the psyop, of the deep fake, of the information warfare, right? So on the one hand, we have the information warfare that is allegedly being conducted or discussed in these tapes. On the other hand, we have the kind of possibility that I want to entertain for a second, right? That this is also, this Honduras Gate investigation is itself a kind of play in that warfare. We will come back to that, but that's just my kind of proviso for the whole sort of conversation. What concretely are in the text? Like, what does Juan Orlando Hernandez want from people, and why would he want things from people? Who is he?
So one of the story of Juan Orlando Hernandez as a political figure in the Honduran context, but in the hemispheric context, I think might also convince your viewers, your listeners, to give additional credence to these alleged audio tapes, because already the things we know about Juan Orlando Hernandez, as you might have from the kind of the letters of his name, is so scandalous and so transnational in its scandalous nature that it gives us a lot of reasons to think that he would be at the center of this kind of criminal web. So Juan Orlando Hernandez is a politician from Honduras's National Party. And the National Party came to power in a military coup that was conducted in 2009 against the legitimate and democratically elected government of Manuel Zelaya. They were elected in 2007. They were liberals, pretty center-left governments, promising pretty moderate social democratic reforms. But Honduras, for decades, has been, even Mel himself, he once described it this way, a democracia tutelada, a tutelage democracy. It remains kind of a colony of the United States. I'll give a couple illustrative details or examples of what that tutelage looks like. When you fly into Tegucigalpa, when you fly into the capital city of Honduras, you don't actually fly into Tegucigalpa, you fly into Palmerola, which is the largest U.S. military base in Latin America. It's also the headquarters of the U.S. Southern Command. So you literally fly into a U.S. military base on your way into the country. And when you're there, in Honduras, this small Central American country, you can see, the country teeming with these U.S. military personnel and a kind of swashbuckling U.S. ambassador who likes to give orders to Honduras's sitting legislators and executive leaders. So it was in that context back in 2007, not to take us too far back in time, that the U.S. began to feel some anxiety around the changing loyalties of Mel Zelaya, in particular his look towards the pink tide. At the time, of course, you had figures like Rafael Correa and Hugo Chavez and Nestor Kirchner and Lula da Silva in Brazil, who were coming to power and who were advancing a project of Latin American integration, specifically, as noted on your diagram, the project of ALBA. ALBA is the sort of the Latin American unity of Bolivarian projects. which was supposed to be in contrast to ALCA, which was the proposal for a free trade union across the Americas that was being put forward and pushed quite hard by then President George W. Bush. So Mel Zelaya began to flirt with the idea of Honduras kind of joining up with these Bolivarian allies and building a stronger bloc to achieve new forms of independence, of autonomy, of sovereignty for Honduras. And that was enough to really scare the US State Department, who made a pretty quiet but overt pact with the Honduran military to overthrow the government of Mel Zelaya. And that happened in 2009. There's very famous images of Mel Zelaya and his family in their pajamas having to flee the presidential palace in their pajamas. And thus began a kind of 12-year reign, kind of dictatorship in Honduras that went from 2009 to 2021. Over the course of that 12-year period, there were two elections, I'm putting those in air quotes for a reason, when the National Party won election through extensive vote rigging. I mean, these were widely condemned elections, even if Hillary Clinton, who had been Secretary of State at the time of the coup, had supported the coup against Mel Zelaya. Even the Obama administration was forced to basically say, these were not legitimate elections. And so Honduras became, very well known as one of the most dangerous, one of the most corrupt, one of the most narco-linked countries, really in the hemisphere, a key node in the criminal networks of narco trafficking. And Juan Orlando Hernandez was the corrupt president, presiding over that narco dictatorship. And it was in that context that Juan Orlando Hernandez was convicted by and extradited. He was in a U.S. court. Convicted to a 45-year sentence for drug trafficking and corruption, and that was supposed to be sort of settled. And the story of Honduran democracy evolved from there. You had in 2022 the arrival of this democratically elected, the return of the Zelaya family, and the election of Xiomara Castro, the country's first woman president, also the wife of Mel Zelaya, the formerly deposed president. And this was supposed to lead to a kind of new democratic refoundation of the country and revisiting a lot of the really corrupt and unconstitutional, the illegal things that happened in the course of the narco dictatorship that had led to so much citizen discontent and the protest vote that ultimately elected Libre, which is the name of her party, the Party of Liberty and Democratic Refoundation. And it goes without saying that this process, the idea of Honduras, this tutelage democracy, once again drifting further to the left, further into the sphere of influence of the hemisphere's progressive forces, was simply unacceptable to the United States, to the US State Department. And some of the moves that they were trying to make, specifically around, for example, revisiting the unconstitutional reforms that had handed over huge parts of Honduran national territory to Peter Thiel, the famed neo-fascist technologist who had overseen a project under the banner of the ZEDES, the Zones of Economic and Zones of Employment and Economic Development, where they had purchased and to govern as their own free enterprise zone, the Caribbean island of Roatan on the Mosquito Coast of Honduras, to run as a kind of crypto colonial Bitcoin, autonomous zone where they could, deregulate everything from labor to the environment. And Libre was running really on a campaign of being like, this was unconstitutional. Juan Orlando Hernandez had to get this through the ZEDES law, he had to sack illegally 5 members of the Honduran Supreme Court, install his cronies to basically push this law through. So there was such a consensus about the criminality, the illegality of the ZEDES, that when they won in 2022, the first thing that they did, by consensus in Congress, that means including members of the National Party itself, they derogated this law. They got rid of the ZEDES law. And this led to a big, this is kind of from where we can date the plot to conduct a kind of vengeance against the government of Xiomara Castro, the family of the Zelayas, the project of Libre, and begin to think about what it might take to reinstall a more puppet regime, a more sort of U.S.-friendly government in Tegucigalpa. And that brings us really to the central scandal that Honduras Gate sheds light on, which is the completely baffling presidential pardon just some months into the prison sentence of Juan Orlando Hernandez, Trump just announces, literally like some weeks before the presidential elections of 2025, that for reasons that not even he could explain, pushed by reporters on Air Force One, he's like, yeah, I just did it. He ends up pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez, and people are like, what the hell? Like, this makes no sense. And one of the benefits of Hondurasgate is it squares the circle, so to speak. It sheds light on the underlying machinations that both led to the pardon itself in a narrow sense, but put the pardon in the context of a broader operation from Honduras to other parts of the hemisphere, to realign interests in service of everyone from Peter Thiel and Trump to Netanyahu to Javier Milei. This constellation that we call the Reactionary International, using a weak point, a weak node of this highly colonized country, Honduras, to manage these operations. And the last thing I'll say, just by way of context, is really to focus, to have this network structure idea of the Reactionary International, and think about strong nodes and weak nodes and pressure points when we think about the projects that we're building across the world and why it matters. Honduras is the place, this is the place that the Banana Republic, the concept of Banana Republic was once used to describe, a place where U.S. corporations like the United Fruit Company held such sway, held such dominant control in Central America that they could coup whoever they want, in the words of Elon Musk. They were powerful enough in close cooperation, association with the U.S. government, to be able to determine who held legitimate or illegitimate power in these places. And I think that we're living in a new kind of corporate colonial moment, where you replace the United Fruit Company with whatever Palantir or Pronomos Capital in the case of Peter Thiel, and we're seeing the repetition of these older colonial dynamics under the banner of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as they would call it, but really just an effort to kind of recolonize the hemisphere, where we're looking at Honduras as just one among so many different types of interventions, so many forms of intervention, so many modes of intervention that stretch from Havana to Caracas to Brasilia, to Santiago de Chile, all the way up to Mexico City, Tegucigalpa, and everywhere in between.
That's extremely thorough. Thank you for setting all of that out in such rich detail. I want to go back to the moment at which Juan Orlando Hernandez is actually convicted of drug trafficking, right? Because if we're painting a picture of a more or less neat synchrony between the forces of, say, the State Department, the forces of reaction, more broadly construed, this particular man, and drug trafficking, and all these different kind of forces coming together, why do they suddenly split apart? Why is he ever convicted, right, of drug trafficking, if there is such a close, almost conspiratorial sort of comity between these different parts? Why did it fall apart?
This, to explain the conviction and the pardon and this kind of schizophrenic relationship that it appears the U.S. has to a figure like Juan Orlando Hernandez, is really to ask a pretty fundamental question about the nature of the U.S. deep state, which has many three-letter agencies and many minds, and can feel quite fickle. But that's because it has to sort of refresh its perception of its own interests every once in a while. And there are few better fields to make sense of that fickleness or that schizophrenia than looking at the drug trade. So you read a book like, Drug Cartels Do Not Exist, right? And you're going to get a picture of how the CIA plays a very, very active role in shaping, constructing, fomenting, pulsating drug cartels to new routes, and really facilitating the drug trade, in the region. You look at a figure like Noriega, right, in Panama, where we were his best friend until we were not, until those drug charges became a liability that we could sort of launch at him to say that you are, part of this drug trade. So we wage this war on drugs, and we use that banner of the war on drugs to go after certain perceived adversaries. And at other times, the drug trade is a very, very convenient way of moving pieces in the hemisphere to our interests. It's highly liquid. It's highly discreet, or you can move cash in ways that don't leave a trace, and you have actors who are already like deep in illicit trade, and it's transnational in scale, right? So you can move money quickly from place to place, and people are pretty sort of fungible in that way. So the U.S. has always played this double game with respect to the drug trade. If you look at the National Security Archive, for example, in the incredible work that they do in places like Mexico, you can see that schizophrenia play out almost on a day-to-day basis, right? Where on the one hand you have the DEA and CIA, setting up the drug trade and setting up the cartels in Mexico. On the other hand, you have operations like the one that was just uncovered last week, where the CIA is acting at the backs of the president of Claudia Sheinbaum to dismantle and go after cartels in cooperation with the state government there in clandestine fashion. And so it would be an exaggeration to say that there's no integrity at all in the U.S. justice system, or there's no entrepreneurial prosecutor, or no one wants to take these issues seriously. It was widely perceived by Hondurans as by the world at large that the arresting conviction of Juan Orlando Hernandez was a good thing, for questions of accountability and democratic integrity, and was an important gesture of goodwill, actually, by the Biden administration. But I think that we would be foolish not to see an undercurrent of cynicism when it comes to the broader U.S. approach to the drug traffic in the region. And again, I insist it's really just because at the end of the day, if you need to get 2 duffel bags of cash onto a politician's table tomorrow, your first call is probably going to be to some of these narco-linked actors who have that kind of liquidity and who have bags of cash that they can move.
So let's understand. Let's sort of go back to our sort of foundational question here. In the series of what is Hondurasgate, in a series of voice notes, Juan Orlando Hernandez asks a bunch of people to do a bunch of things. I have a bunch of them on the screen. We have, of course, the actual current president. We have Tomas Zambrano. We have Jorge Calais, and I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing people's names left, right, center here. We have the current vice president. We have all these different kind of parts of the scheme. People can look this up or pause the video and read the text on the screen. But which of these do you think is the most sort of important for understanding what kinds of things he's trying to do in order to secure his return to the presidency in next time round, which seems to be the ultimate goal here?
Certainly Juan Orlando Hernandez's is his own goal, but I think that we have to put a pause in this, because I think that one of the issues with reading too much into Juan Orlando Hernandez in this story is that he's really nothing but a pawn. So what's most important to the bigger players in this is not positioning Juan Orlando Hernandez, in the presidency necessarily. He's seen by the U.S. and the Israelis as being the most pliant and certainly the most indebted. So what these audios reveal, or allegedly reveal in his own words, is the ways in which, for example, the state of Israel and the kind of budgetary, the pots of money that have been made available by the government of Benjamin Netanyahu flow into this pressure campaign that, as you have in your map, is led by Roger Stone out of Florida, to put pressure or perhaps purchase directly a presidential pardon for Juan Orlando Hernandez, who will then be a vector of influence back at home. And so, to understand, the state of Israel's role in this, I think the state of Israel is not new to the region, I should say. There's a history there of engagements, counterinsurgents engagements. An influence that's really decades old. But insofar as Latin America as a continent has assumed greater protagonism in pushing back against Israeli impunity since the genocide began in earnest against the Palestinian people in 2023, the state of Israel has become much more proactive in thinking about Latin America as a zone of influence. It's not a coincidence that either that to the governments that were foundational in the formation of the Hague Group, that diplomatic bloc that was founded to defend international law and stand up for the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people. Immediately when they came to power in Bolivia and indeed in Honduras, the first thing they did was to lead that Hague Group. And Tito Asfura, this guy, this is the candidate of the National Party, the same party as Juan Orlando Hernandez, a true puppet kind of guy. He was a joke, his campaign slogan was Papi a la orden, daddy on demand. I guess you'd translate it, and it's not a coincidence that the first thing he does when he wins, and
that's again in square quotes, yes.
Oh, hugely, yes. I think that the most serious election observers in our network would characterize this as a kind of electoral coup with such severe irregularities and such an incredible chain of events that don't just have to do with like the kind of naked swaying of votes. One of the things I can see on your map, Richard, is how Trump broke the law so many times to threaten the Honduran people if they didn't vote for the right candidate and strip away their financial assistance, but also conducting kind of like outright campaigning and proselytizing after the window for formal campaigning had closed. So by Honduran law, you're supposed to have an electoral silence, but really in the machinations of this. And these are things that we know because Libre had the wisdom to appoint its former finance minister, a very brilliant young man with a really sterling record named Marlon Ochoa, to the National Electoral Council, where he was, just one among many people from many different parties, to try to, protect and defend the integrity of the democratic process in Honduras, and was documenting the ways in which, Zoom calls would be stonewalled, the meetings of the council would be sabotaged, that all of the irregularities that he was pointing to in vote rigging and vote counting and vote buying were not being taken seriously by the majority of the council, to allow this very close election to tip against the liberal candidate, Nasrallah, towards this guy, Tito Asfura. And the first thing that Tito Asfura does upon getting into government, before he's even in government, he's just president-elect, is to go to Israel. You have to ask what a Honduran president-elect in a country with so many problems, such bad violence, such bad poverty, why is the first thing that they're doing going to Israel? Similar, Javier Milei is a fanatical, what do we call them? Judeo-Christian, whatever, civilizationist, and he's obsessed with Israel. But it's still extremely weird the extent to which, a country like Argentina, which doesn't really have historical ties with the state of Israel, is engaged in this kind of intense bilateral relationship. And all of that begins to make sense when we see these flows of cash, when we see the influence operations, when we see the ways in which Israel is basically buying its way towards the abandonment of the Hague Group, any form of accountability with respect to its war crimes in occupied Palestine, and a shift towards, again, back towards the national party's dominance, criminal dominance in Honduras, the narrow outcome of which, in this case, Richard, is that Marlon Ochoa, as you have it in some choice quotes there, his life is endangered pretty much immediately upon trying to hold the reins of democratic accountability, and he now lives in exile. And many others have had to follow suit as the campaign of persecution against any of those who've tried to hold on to any form of accountability for this have suffered the same fate. And this brings us back, I think, Richard, to the same question you put in the outset about the integrity or veracity of these recordings. I'm not fucking Sherlock Holmes, but it is suspicious that, after their release, that their servers were attacked over 30,000 times from the United States and Israel. It's not something that you could imagine them investing such resources and time and effort to do if they could really just sort of wish them away by saying these are obviously deep fakes or actors speaking in our name. So I blushed over a bit of some of those details of the kind of
Sure.
real influence operation. We can easily zoom in there, or you tell me, Richard, what you think is most interesting about the kind of narrow aspects of bringing Juan Orlando Hernandez to power. But to me, they're less interesting because that's just classic National Party stuff. That's like classic, okay, we're taking as a given that we are a kind of colony now in Honduras. So we're just going to play this chess game along with these broader geo-economic dominant players so that we can reposition ourselves to run a kind of, enduring National Party, again, kind of narco dictatorship in the country, which is what we're really at risk of returning to now in Honduras.
I guess the kind of question I have about that kind of bigger picture thing is the way in which we respond to it as progressives, right, which we're now calling ourselves for some reason that I think is maybe kind of interesting to go into maybe another time, as the left, right? And whether or not we respond with this kind of fatalism about corruption, about the extraordinary capacities, it seems, of that international network that you're calling the reactionary international, or how we respond with something like a kind of agentic move to try and understand what it is that are actually the levers in the situation, when it seems like, oh, well, people can be arrested and they can be put in prison for 45 years, and then they can just be sort of instantly released when Trump decides, possibly on the back of an influence campaign run by Roger Stone, possibly with money from Israel, who knows. Like, there's a kind of fatalism that is bred, an outrage and a fatalism that go together, right? And I'm wondering how you see through that as a kind of a consequence of this feeling of living in a world of endless plots, conspiracies, psyops, and so on.
I find it to be immensely blackpilling that the perceived high point of accountability for the 12-year narco dictatorship in Honduras, which claimed, hundreds of lives, destroyed hundreds of communities, was an entirely unnecessary and wasteful experiment in recolonization of Honduras to the detriment of the nation and the region at large. Very blackpilling at the peak of accountability was an extradition and U.S. indictment incarceration of a Honduran leader, as opposed to a robust justice system, pursuing accountability for that. Not to say that that's costless as well. You may recall in the case of Bolivia, 2019, there was a U.S.-backed coup against the government of Evo Morales that was also very bloody, led to tremendous repression by the coup government of Ginny Nanez against peasant and campesino laborers and protesters who were trying to demand accountability for their stolen democracy in the name of the Catholic Church and these mining interests, and even the British embassy was very involved in the machinations behind that coup. And when the MAS came back to power 1 year later in this impressive show of force by the country's popular forces, Áñez, as well as Camacho, another kind of right-wing conspirator, were put in prison for criminal conspiracy. And that was widely condemned as a kind of overreach by the MAS. This was considered to be a form of vengeance, an absence of kind of, the generous spirit of democratic reconciliation. And there is a challenge that we have when it comes as the left to the asymmetries that attend to this kind of thing. And the asymmetries run all the way down, right? If such a scheme had been exposed from the left, and as the general coordinator of the Progressive International, I wish, I do wish at times that we had the scale, agility, and the absence of scruples to be able to put together something of this scale, of this ambition, of this nature, like the one that Honduras Gate has revealed. I think that one of the big problems is we don't have the buckets of cash, right? Our pockets are not that deep, they're not that liquid. We're not really able to put together on short notice to buy people off, let alone would we, according to those principles. But I think the overwhelming picture that we get here I'm coming back to the main theme that I think hangs over Hondurasgate, is the theme of colonialism. What's at stake here is whether these countries are genuinely autonomous, genuinely independent, and therefore genuinely able to pursue sovereign trajectories of development, or whether they are recolonized in service of a project of underdevelopment. This is what Allende used to say before he was also couped and killed, and another narco dictator was installed by the name of Pinochet in Chile, where he said, imperialism is underdevelopment and underdevelopment is imperialism. I mean, these things really are, they go hand in hand. I think as Marxists, as leftists, we have an obligation to be not distracted by the pyrotechnics of the, or at least not exclusively distracted by the pyrotechnics of the, actual kind of operation at the surface level, but really be attentive to the underlying dynamics of economic extraction, the fundamental interests that underline everything from Operation Condor, which it was the 20th century effort by the United States to lead these sweeping interventions all over the Latin American continent that saw the installation of military dictatorships from Brazil to Argentina to Chile and Bolivia, beyond. And now I think, with the shameless application of this so-called Trump corollary or the Don Roe doctrine, we're really talking about, again, the realignment of the hemisphere towards U.S. interests. And that's not against like narrow, other sectors that are competing with U.S. sectors, right? It's just against the prospects for adjusting to, or trying to fight against declining terms of trade, trying to keep the Latins down, and mired in the kind of poverty that allows them to be allows them and their communities and their lands to be easily exploited. I think that explains a lot of the reason why Honduras Gate, takes us to this place. One of the other revelations is this proposal, very nicely funded proposal that links Milei, the Republican Party, some of their consultants and the Israelis in a new media kind of operation, a propaganda operation that wants to destabilize and take on people like Gustavo Petro and as I mentioned, Mexico's Claudia Sheinbaum, two proponents of new forms of emancipation, new forms of independence, new forms of sovereignty as a way of pushing more egalitarian and distributed development for their people. This is very threatening to the United States. It always has been. And I do believe in a more ecclesiastical, in a biblical sense, like, there really isn't anything new under the sun of the Monroe Doctrine. There's a 200-year project to bring these interests under kind of U.S. alignment, to bring these countries rather under the alignment of U.S. interests, I should say. And I'm not really convinced that Honduras Gate tells us anything more other than, the fact that the state of Israel has become a very useful appendage of this story because of the ways in which Netanyahu has been so successful in incubating new forms of spyware and surveillance technology, and they're kind of also flush with cash. And I could tell you stories all day long about Israel's involvement in, for example, selling spyware to the government of Ivan Duque, the predecessor of Gustavo Petro, in an airport hangar. I think we spoke about that the last time I saw you, but I think that that this is an old story with new trappings. And as you say, I think the challenge is for the left is to say, they're beating us at an old game. It's not as if we're so dumbfounded by some new technology. And in many ways, the idea that these are not deep fakes, that they are just audio recordings, is even more embarrassing for us. Like, these are people just saying crimes into a WhatsApp audio and sending it with such shamelessness, with such a perception of impunity that they're leaking out. And as yet, Richard, we haven't seen a single friendly government, a single ambitious prosecutor, let alone a single sitting member of U.S. Congress, or a single mainstream media outlet report on, ask questions about, or demand accountability for the crimes that are enumerated in the Honduras Gate investigations. I mean,
so in the defense of the mainstream media, which is not something I normally do.
There we go. Now we're really going somewhere. Stop there.
That's not quite how I meant to begin that one. They have obligations of fact-checking and so on. And
no,
you are
right. Hold on.
There is something under the sun, right?
Let's just pause there. Because if we're talking about asymmetries between the right and the left, let's just pause there. Okay? The New York Times, Axios, Washington Post, these people are absolute stenographers for unverified claims that come to them from
Of
the U.S.
course.
government. So if the U.S. government calls them and says, as happened a few days ago, Cuba's acquired 300 military drones they intend to use against U.S. interests, at Guantanamo Bay, they're just going to write it and then put a comma at the end. They often do this with Israel, right?
Sources say.
Missile strikes, Hamas missile strikes, blah, blah, comma, Israel says. Why wouldn't it just be, presidential pardon sold by Trump, leaks allege, comma. There are ways that the mainstream media actually is quite talented at doing syntactical constructions that can account for unverified or pre-verified claims. So I don't take their silence as being any kind of evidence of their integrity, but rather their incuriosity, or worse, their complicity in these schemes. I know it's not what you're saying. I'm just saying, let's not let them off the hook so easily.
Totally. So I know completely. But there are obligations, particularly when they have to talk about their benefactors, their other sources, right? So you can't. If you are the New York Times, for example, it is very difficult to say the State Department sort of colluded in some way in a coup in Honduras in 2009, right? That is a thing that would be difficult to say, because then you wouldn't get sourcing for your other stories. I'm not saying they are I'm just saying they exist in a sort of network of power, and it makes sense that they wouldn't. We're agreeing, I think, on that point. On this particular story, there is a sense that what you're saying about there is nothing new under the sun, right, is true, but that's in part because it's almost like, and I'm not saying this is the case, it's almost like if I was in a lab concocting a conspiracy that would grab David Adler, this is what I would come up with.
I don't know.
Right?
There's too much.
Maybe that's just you're right.
There's too much shit there. I love my friends. I do, and I have respect also for a lot of the political actors and operators in my space. I don't think anyone is really creative enough to do this. I know you've got listed here Phonexia, who claimed that that these leaks had been sort of published without their knowledge, and that's right, because because Honduras Gate just did it with a standard account. So they, when they were pushed on this, Honduras Gate acknowledged that they didn't have express permission to use their logo, the Phonexia logo on the website. But
I'm not talking about that. That's trivial stuff, right?
I just mean to say the breadth and depth of these and their alignment with the things we already know to be true.
I totally get that.
Yeah,
I totally get that.
I think, but in a way, what I'm trying to say is, and this, if I can speak more to your question around accountability and where we go from here, is I'm putting an emphasis on drawing your attention to a 150-year story from the banana republics of old to the Sedes of new, because I think that it should always already be our expectation that these things are happening. I mean, I've met enough spooks in my life on the road, in my great international odyssey with the Progressive International and elsewhere, to know that these places are crawling with CIA people, with spies, with people whose jobs it is to run interference and pay off certain people. And I've seen enough duffel bags of cash in my career to understand that things happen all the time to try to buy votes and buy influence and carve new paths towards different political outcomes that may or may not reflect the democratic will of the people. So what's more interesting to me is the institutional development that can militate against those forms of pernicious influence and create a more vigilant capacity of a democratic population of a society to care. One of the scary things about what's happening in Honduras Gate is the absence of a more robust civil social response, in Tegucigalpa or in San Pedro Sula or in one of these cities. We ask the question, why aren't people mobilizing by their thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands on the streets? Were this the case? And that's a deeper question. I think it's a harder question for us to look in the mirror and ask. Why is it that these scandals aren't generating more social outrage? Even if you put aside the question of mainstream media complicity, I think that's kind of where you might be going, and I think that that's a really, really helpful place to start for progressive forces. And And it's not one that just attends to Hondurasgate, but rather Pandora Papers, Panama Papers, WikiLeaks, LuxLeaks, a series of revelations that are equally scandalous. The Panama Papers,
and from which very little
arguably
happens.
More.
Yeah.
Yes, nothing has happened. No one's been to prison. The Epstein files.
Yep.
So we live in an era of these naked conspiracies, and which is why my heart rate kind of stays low when we're talking about the veracity of these alleged crimes. I think that.
Let me tell you what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
let me tell you why I'm asking this question. Right? It's not to pour cold water on it or say, actually, this is all sort of nonsense, and you're just being caught by some sort of psyop that is designed almost somehow surreally for you or something like this, or any of that. That's not what I'm getting at. Obviously, what I mean to say is that almost everyone watching this lives in an environment that is flooded with allegations of conspiracy, right? And you have given me a very compelling account of the way in which this thing, this Honduras Gate conspiracy, relates to a deeper history, right, of colonial domination of Latin America, right? But at the same time, there is a kind of discipline, right, that we need so that we don't simply believe every claim that comes along as it comes along, right? And this is why I'm asking the question of the veracity. Not because I'm particularly doubtful of this or I think this is particularly nonsense, but because there is a kind of discipline that is required because we are increasingly going to live in a world dominated by allegations of this kind, right? When the deep faking is really going to be more possible than it is even now. And it's already pretty good.
Yeah. I think that that's true, not for the reasons that you're saying. I agree with you, not because of the logic that you are articulating. I agree with you because of the asymmetry that I was describing before, which is to say that if the right wing, if the more established poderes fácticos, real powers that be, were to come out with a similar accusation of criminality by our progressive forces, then we would go to prison because they hold the keys to the jail cell, right? And we don't. So I agree with you that we need to be careful about the veracity of claims, because I think that we need to be careful about how they could equally, such deep fakes or potentially, untrue claims could be weaponized against us in future, right? And they already are, right? We can see today the U.S. State Department came out with new sanctions against the organizers of the Global Sunwood Flotilla, who they claim are, Hamas operatives operating, against U.S. interests across the world. Right? We can see how their own kind of red yarned maps set the stage without the application of real kind of, juridical and technological discipline, as you say, can set the stage for our potential incarceration. So I agree with you on that. Where I am less convinced about the need to kind of wring our hands until they're bloody about these questions of AI, deep fakey stuff when it comes to Honduras Gate, which I personally am quite convinced is real, is because the institutional response would not really change if it were true and were not true. The prescriptions that we need as leftists, as anti-colonialists, as the progressive forces of the hemisphere and the world at large, are not different, kind of regardless of whether they're true or whether they're not. Right? We need democracies that are immune to this kind of whether it's misinformation or vote buying or corrupt forms of presidential pardon. We need institutional fortification that can guarantee sovereignty on its terms, or in the case of the United States, the integrity of a judicial system that can hold leaders account for potential crimes. So I think even if we were to just look at the Operation Condor, even if we had no information, even if I woke up tomorrow and had 50 years of amnesia and was just looking at the sort of history of U.S.-American intervention in the 20th century, I would still advise our allies and friends in Latin America to do everything that they can to create, new forms of independence, strategic autonomy, technological sovereignty that can militate against U.S. influence, because this is a country that sure, may vibrate between partisan presidencies, but ultimately is dead set on the domination of its so-called backyard.
David Adler, well, thank you for doing your own research.
Thanks, Richard.